should have realized the air had changed when the Buddhist monk at the altar faltered mid-chant, his eyes darting toward the entrance of the funeral hall. But I didn't truly understand until the double doors swung open and 5 men in tailored charcoal suits materialized against the white funeral ribbons like ink bleeding into silk. The man in the center, Ji-hoon Kang, didn't look at the altar or the portrait of my mother or the mourning candles. He looked directly at me, with a gaze so heavy and expectant I felt the oxygen leave my lungs. He looked like a man who had been waiting for my mother to die just so he could finally collect me. The shift in the room was silent but violent. My few remaining relatives didn't scream, they simply evaporated. Aunts who had been wailing minutes ago suddenly checked their watches, bowed frantically to the air, and scurried toward the elevators with apologies I didn't hear. Even the funeral staff retreated into the back offices, the heavy click of the lock echoing in the hollow hall. I stayed exactly where I was, kneeling on the thin floor mat before my mother's memorial portrait. The scent of incense was thick, mixing with the smell of rain from the men's damp shoulders. I had chosen the cheapest wake package available, a 3-day service I'd had to put on a high-interest credit card I couldn't pay back. Everything since her heart stopped had been a blur of high costs and hidden ledgers. My mother had left me nothing but a mountain of debt and a history I'd spent 10 years trying to delete. I looked up as Ji-hoon stopped just inches from my mat. I realized then that my mother hadn't just left me secrets. She had left me her employer. The silence that followed the departure of Ji-hoon Kang's men was heavier than the funeral dirge had ever been. I sat on the floor mat, my knees aching, staring at the small, leather-bound ledger Ji-sung-oh had dropped onto the table before they left. It looked ordinary, a standard account book my mother might have used for her grocery lists, but the weight of the air around it felt toxic. With trembling fingers, I pulled it toward me. The paper was crisp, smelling faintly of the same sandalwood incense currently burning at her altar. I opened the first page, expecting to see her neat, cursive handwriting detailing small household expenses. Instead, the columns were filled with alphanumeric codes, property coordinates, and dates that stretched back 2 decades. As I flipped through the pages, the questionable history I had spent my adult life fleeing began to crystallize into a terrifying reality. My mother hadn't just been an archival hobbyist or a retired clerk. She was a ghost in the machine. Every entry represented a scrubbed title, a redirected tax lien, or a deed that had been digitally erased from the municipal records to favor the Kang Syndicate. Then I reached the final section, the debts. The numbers were staggering. My mother hadn't just been working for Ji-hoon, she had been borrowing against his protection. There were lists of medical premiums for her private treatments, high-interest bridge loans she'd taken to keep our family apartment, and indemnity fees for errors she'd allegedly made in the past. The total at the bottom was a sum I couldn't earn in 3 lifetimes as a freelance researcher. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. She hadn't left me an inheritance. She had left me a bill for her life, and Ji-hoon Kang was the collector. A loose scrap of paper fell from the back of the ledger. It was a handwritten note in my mother's jagged, final script. Minjai, the truth is never in the files they show you. It's in the space between the recordings. Find the 1994 gap, or we both vanish. I realized then that the ghost deed Ji-hoon wanted wasn't just a document. It was the only thing standing between me and the erasure my mother had narrowly avoided. My desperation, once a dull ache of grief, sharpened into a jagged edge of survival. I wasn't just mourning a woman I barely knew anymore. I was investigating a criminal I was legally bound to. I closed the ledger, the snap of the leather echoing through the empty hall. The 7-day clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. The black sedan moved through the city like a predatory shadow, the rain-slicked streets of Seoul blurring into streaks of neon. I sat in the back seat, the weight of the ledger heavy on my lap, while Ji-sung-oh drove with a silent, mechanical precision. Beside me, Ji-hoon Kang remained a statue of expensive wool and cold intent, his gaze never leaving the window until we descended into a subterranean parking garage far from the eyes of the public. 7 days, Minjai, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very bones of the car. Every hour you spend sleeping is an hour my enemies spend digging. Do not waste my time. The doors were opened for me, and I was led into a sprawling, industrial space that felt more like a vault than a residence. It was a high-security, safe house carved out of a former banking archive. The air was dry and climate-controlled, stripped of all humidity to preserve the thousands of boxes that lined the floor-to-ceiling steel shelves. This was my mother's true legacy, the physical overflow of 20 years of clandestine record-keeping. "Everything is here," Ji-sung said, gesturing to the rows of gray archival boxes. "Digital backups, physical deeds, and the personal correspondence your mother deemed too dangerous for a cloud server. You have a workstation, a secure line, and a cot. You do not leave until the ghost deed is found." The heavy steel door groaned shut behind them, the sound of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous room. I was alone with the dust. I approached the workstation, where a high-resolution scanner and 3 monitors sat waiting like hungry altars. I pulled the first box from the shelf. As I cracked the lid, a puff of stagnant air hit me, the smell of old ink, decaying glue, and my mother's lingering perfume. It was an overwhelming, suffocating sensory overload. I began the grueling process of cross-referencing the ledger's alphanumeric codes with the physical files. Each folder I opened was a testament to the life she'd hidden from me: property transfers for shell companies, offshore accounts, and the messy, redacted histories of men like Ji-hoon Kang. My eyes burned as the hours bled into one another, the silence of the vault occasionally broken by the hum of the air filtration system. By the end of the first night, my fingers were gray with the dust of 30-year-old tax filings. I had found everything: embezzlement, fraud, corporate theft, everything except the one thing that could save me. The 1994 gap was still a void. I looked at the ticking digital clock on the monitor. Day 1 was dying, and the ghost I was hunting remained invisible. The stale air of the vault began to taste like metallic copper as the 3rd day bled into the 4th. My eyes were webbed with red veins, the blue light of the monitors searing into my retinas. I had dissected 1,000 files, but the year 1994 remained a stubborn scar in the ledger, a period where the Kang Syndicate's acquisitions simply ceased to exist on paper. I pulled a weathered topographical map of the redevelopment district from a bottom drawer, overlaying it with the digital property IDs I'd spent all night extracting. That's when the irregularity finally screamed at me. It wasn't an error of addition, it was an error of omission. A prime 3-block radius in the heart of the district, currently slated for a multi-billion one-high-rise project, had no recorded transfer deed between a defunct textile company and the Kang Holding Group. The chain of title stopped abruptly in the spring of '94. On the official public records, the land was a legal no-man's land, a technicality that should have been impossible. My mother hadn't lost the deed. She had hidden the fact that it never legally moved. The realization made my stomach drop. This wasn't just a missing document. It was a structural weakness, a kill switch. I pulled up the recent filings from the municipal court and saw the shark's fins circling in the water. Sang-woo Choi's legal team had already filed an action to quiet title for that exact coordinate. He wasn't just trying to buy the land. He was using the 1994 gap to argue that Ji-hoon's ownership was a decades-long fraud. If Choi succeeded, he wouldn't just take the property. He would trigger a RICO investigation that would dismantle the entire Kang empire under the weight of its own illegitimate history. I leaned back, the chair groaning in the silence. My mother had known this day would come. She had kept this gap as her ultimate leverage, a dead man's switch that she had passed to me like a poisoned chalice. A shadow flickered at the edge of the monitor's glow. I turned to find Ji-hoon standing by the steel door, his silhouette cutting through the dim light. He didn't ask if I'd found it. He simply looked at the map, then at the frantic notations on my screen. "Choi is moving faster than we anticipated," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "His lawyers are at the courthouse now. Tell me you have the bridge to cross that gap, Min-jae." "The bridge doesn't exist in the archives, Ji-hoon," I whispered, my voice raspy from disuse. "My mother didn't file the deed because the original owner died before signing it, but she left a note about the space between recordings. There's a corrective filing hidden somewhere outside this room, and if Sang-woo Choi finds it first, we're both as good as dead." The transition from the sterile, dust-choked vault to the humid chaos of the city's back alleys felt like a physical blow. I sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked SUV, my fingers still stained with archival ink, watching the reflection of neon signs dance across Ji-hoon stone-cold expression. He didn't drive like a man in a hurry. He drove like a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. "Your mother didn't just keep paper," Ji-hoon said, his voice grating like gravel. "She kept a shadow drive, a physical server containing the unredacted digital logs of the 94 acquisitions. It was stolen 3 days after her heart stopped." The destination was a crumbling electronics market in the underbelly of the city, a labyrinth of cramped stalls and illegal signal boosters. We moved through the crowd, Ji-hoon's presence acting like a kinetic force that parted the sea of people. He didn't look at the wares, he looked at the exits, his hand never straying far from the inner lining of his jacket. We reached a shuttered storefront at the end of a damp corridor. Without a word, Ji-hoon kicked the door inward. The sound of splintering wood was swallowed by the heavy thrum of cooling fans. Inside, a terrified technician sat surrounded by gutted hardware. On the workbench, illuminated by a harsh desk lamp, was a compact, black server tower, my mother's digital ghost. "I told you I needed more time to crack the encryption," the technician stammered, his hands raised in a frantic plea. Ji-hoon didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, the professional violence in his posture making the air in the small room feel thin. He grabbed the technician by the collar, hoisting him upward until his feet dangled. "The encryption isn't for you to crack," Ji-hoon whispered. "It's for her." He dropped the man and gestured for me to step forward. My heart hammered against my ribs as I connected my portable drive to the server. This was the moment of truth. My mother's passwords were never random. They were a map of our shared, broken history. I typed in the date of the only birthday she'd ever missed, the year I'd tried to run away. The screen flickered, then flooded with data. Rows of raw, unencrypted files from 1994 began to scroll past. "Is it there?" Ji-hoon asked, his shadow looming over me, dark and absolute. "It's more than just a deed," I whispered, watching the names of shell companies and deceased witnesses populating the screen. "It's the evidence of why the original owner never signed." As the download bar hit 100%, a low, rhythmic thud echoed from the corridor outside. Ji-hoon's head snapped toward the door, his hand instantly reaching for his weapon. "We're leaving. Now, Choi's people didn't just find the server, they followed the signal." The roar of the engine was the only thing shielding us from the realization that the world outside was systematically being dismantled. By the time we returned to the safe house, the digital monitors that had once shown dusty archives were now bleeding crimson with news alerts and legal injunctions. Sang-woo Choi hadn't just found our trail. He had decided to burn the entire forest down. The white-collar siege began at 9:00 a.m. In a coordinated strike across 3 jurisdictions, Sang-woo's legal team had filed a massive RICO civil suit against every front company under the Kang Syndicate's umbrella. On the screens, I watched the financial lifeblood of Ji-hoon's empire freeze in real time. Assets were being locked, bank accounts flagged for suspicious activity, and cease and desist orders were being physically served to every foreman at the redevelopment site. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the vault, his phone vibrating incessantly on the desk, a discarded relic. He didn't answer it. He watched the scrolling ticker of his collapsing businesses with a terrifying, calm detachment. The controlled danger I had seen at my mother's wake was now a cold, absolute vacuum. "He's not just suing for the land," I whispered, my voice trembling as I parsed the legal filings. "He's using the 1994 gap as the predicate act for racketeering. He's telling the court that because this single property was never legally transferred, everyone earned from it for 30 years is a criminal proceed." The strategy was brilliant and brutal. By freezing the assets, Choi was stripping Ji-hoon of the power to fight back. No lawyers could be paid, no contractors could be silenced, and no enforcers could be funded. It was a legal strangulation. Ji-hoon stood by the door, his jaw tight, his hand twitching near his holster. He was a man built for physical wars, now helpless against a barrage of paperwork. "We have 48 hours before the state appoints a receiver," he grunted. "If they get into the internal ledgers, it's over." "He's banking on the fact that the ghost deed is a myth," I said, turning back to the server we had barely escaped with. "He thinks my mother was just a clever fraud. He doesn't know that the space between the recordings isn't an absence of truth, it's a hidden layer." I felt Ji-hoon's presence behind me, a heavy, silent shadow. "Then find the layer, Minjai," he commanded. "Choi is using the law as a noose. Use your mother's secrets to turn it into a trap." The pressure was no longer just a weight, it was a crushing force. My mother's ledger lay open beside the server, her jagged handwriting a haunting reminder that I was the only one left who could read the language of her lies. The siege was outside the walls, but the battle was here, in the silence of the dust. The blue light of the workstation felt like a cold interrogation lamp as I watched the data transfer logs crawl across the secondary monitor. I had set a digital tripwire, a simple ghost file that would alert me if anyone touched the 1994 server root without my authorization. I had expected a hack from the outside, a probe from Sang-woo Choi's legal team. I hadn't expected the signal to come from the secure tablet I'd given to the only person I trusted. Hana Song sat in the corner of the vault, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. She was supposedly helping me categorize the physical deeds, but her thumbs were moving with a frantic, rhythmic speed that didn't match the slow pace of archival work. I didn't say a word. I simply mirrored her screen onto my primary monitor. My heart didn't just break, it went cold. She wasn't just looking at files. She was duplicating the unredacted digital logs we had recovered from the electronics market, the very evidence Sang-woo Choi needed to finish the Rico strangulation. She was sending them to an encrypted cloud server with a header that bore the initials SWC. Is the coffee that bad, Hana? Or is the paycheck from Choi just that much better? She jumped, the tablet sliding from her lap and clattering onto the concrete floor. The silence that followed was sharp enough to bleed. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't offer a frantic excuse. She just looked at me with a mixture of shame and a terrifying, weary resentment. "You don't understand, Minjai," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They came to me months ago, my brother's gambling debts. Choi said he'd make them go away. He said you were already drowning anyway, that your mother had already buried you. I'm just trying to survive." "By burying me deeper?" I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I brought you here because I thought you were the one thing in my life that wasn't a transaction. I thought you were my friend." "In this world, friendship is a luxury neither of us can afford," she snapped, her guilt turning into a jagged defense. "Look around you. You're working for a monster, living in a tomb, chasing a dead woman's lies. Choi is going to win. I'm just picking the winning side." Before I could respond, the steel door hissed open. Ji-sung-oh stepped into the room, his presence instantly vacuuming the remaining air from the vault. He didn't look at me. He looked at the tablet on the floor, then at Hana. "The signal was intercepted," Ji-sung said, his voice a low, lethal hum. Hana's face went white. She looked at me, a final, desperate plea in her eyes, but I looked away. The Judas signal had been sent, but what Hana didn't know was that I had already swapped the root directory. What she had sent to Sang-woo Choi wasn't the gold he was waiting for, it was the poison I had prepared to destroy him. Ji-sung's hand moved toward Hana, but I stepped into his path, my gaze fixed on the flashing upload bar on the monitor. "Don't," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "She's already sent it. If you stop her now, Choi will know we've compromised the leak. Let the signal finish." Hana looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. She didn't realize that the ghost deed directory she had just duplicated was a digital mirage I had constructed hours ago. While she thought she was stealing the Syndicate's death warrant, she was actually transmitting a Trojan horse of fraudulent metadata. I turned back to the screen, my fingers flying across the keys to mask the source code. The files she sent contain embedded watermarks and backdated timestamps that link directly to Sang-woo Choi's private server. I explained to the room, though my words were meant for Ji-hoon, who had appeared in the doorway like a silent omen. When he presents this evidence in court to support his RICO suit, he won't be proving our fraud. He'll be submitting evidence that can be traced back to his own illegal hacking and document tampering. He's about to walk into a courtroom and hand the judge his own confession. The irony was a bitter weight in my chest. I was using my mother's darkest trick, the art of making a lie look more real than the truth. I was no longer just an archival specialist. I was a master of the space between recordings. Ji-hoon stepped closer, the cold light of the monitors reflecting in his dark eyes. He didn't look at Hana. He looked at the scrolling lines of code I was using to bait the trap. "You're feeding him his own greed," he murmured, a hint of grim approval in his voice. "He wants to dismantle your empire using the law," I said, hitting the final enter key to seal the transmission. "So we'll give him exactly what he wants, a legal noose that tightens the more he pulls. He'll think he's won until the moment the bailiff realizes the documents in his hand were manufactured on a server Choi reported, stolen, 3 days ago." Ji-sung gripped Hana's arm, pulling her away from the workstation. She didn't fight him. She looked broken, a casualty of a war she hadn't been built for. As they let her out, the silence of the vault returned, but it was no longer heavy with grief. It was charged with the static of an impending explosion. The trap was set. Now, all we had to do was wait for Sang-woo Choi to pull the trigger. The morning air was a frigid reminder of the stakes as we tore through the city toward the municipal records office. In my lap sat the true ghost deed, the physical, corrective filing my mother had hidden not in a digital cloud, but within the hollowed-out spine of an old property law book. It was the only original document that could neutralize Sang-woo Choi's legal assault, and we had exactly 40 minutes before the court-ordered injunction would freeze Ji-hoon's ability to file any new titles. Ji-sung drove like a man possessed, weaving the SUV through the gridlock of Seoul's morning rush hour while his radio crackled with updates from our legal team. Choi's men weren't just in the courtrooms, they were on the streets. 2 black sedans appeared in the rearview mirror, drifting across lanes with reckless intent. "They're moving to intercept," Ji-sung grunted, his foot heavy on the accelerator. Beside me, Ji-hoon remained a pillar of icy resolve. He checked his watch, then looked at the weathered parchment in my hands. "If that document doesn't reach the registrar's desk by 9:00 a.m., the poisoned data you leaked won't matter. Choi will have the injunction, and the land will be his by default." The records office loomed ahead, a gray monolith of bureaucracy. As we screeched to a halt, the pursuit cars slammed into the curb behind us. Men in suits spilled out, eyes fixed on the leather folder I clutched to my chest. Ji-sung was out of the door before the engine had stopped, his physical presence forming a human shield between me and the encroaching shadows. "Run, Minjai," he commanded, his voice a roar that commanded the sidewalk. I didn't look back. I bolted up the stone steps, my lungs burning in the cold air. The lobby was a maze of red tape and slow-moving lines, but I didn't stop for a ticket. I dove past the security cordon, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of a struggle, Ji-sung and Ji-hoon holding the line at the entrance, ensuring no one followed. I reached the registrar's window at 8:58 a.m. The clerk looked up, unimpressed by my disheveled state. "You need a queue number, miss." "This is a corrective filing for the Kang Redevelopment District," I gasped, slamming the deed onto the counter. "Recording ID 1994 Alpha. It has to be stamped now." She hesitated, her hand hovering over a ringing phone, likely Choi's lawyers trying to signal the injunction. "I have to verify the signature." "Look at the seal," I whispered, leaning in. "It's my mother's seal, it's perfect." At 8:59 a.m., the heavy metal stamp descended with a definitive thwack. The ghost deed was no longer a secret, it was a matter of public record. The race was over, and for the first time in 7 days, I could finally breathe. The ink on the registrar's stamp was barely dry when the world outside the records office shifted on its axis. By the time I walked back down those stone steps, the white-collar siege had turned into a total rout for Sang-woo Choi. His legal team, caught in the trap of their own manufactured evidence, was facing immediate disbarment and a criminal inquiry into document tampering. The Rico suit hadn't just stalled. It had imploded, dragging Choi into the very vortex he had prepared for us. Ji-hoon was waiting by the car, the tension that had gripped his shoulders for a week finally replaced by a terrifying, quiet grace. He didn't ask for the receipt. He saw it in the way I held my head. "The debt is cleared, Min-jae," he said, his voice reflecting the calm after a storm. "The interest, the indemnity fees, the loans your mother carried, everything has been balanced. You owe the syndicate nothing." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a collector or a ghost from my mother's past. I saw a man who had watched me walk into the fire and come out with the ashes of his enemies. "I spent 10 years running from who she was," I said, my voice steady in the crisp morning air. "I thought her secrets were a cage, but they were a language, and I'm the only one left who speaks it." Ji-hoon stepped closer, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't pull out a contract or a ledger. He handed me a simple, black-and gold card. It bore my name and a title that hadn't existed yesterday, Director of Strategic Acquisitions and Intelligence. "I don't need a servant who works to pay off the past," Ji-hoon murmured, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I need a partner who can build the future, someone who sees the space between the recordings and knows how to fill it." I took the card, the weight of it a strange, new kind of freedom. I wasn't going back to the quiet, anonymous life of a freelance researcher. That woman had died in the dust of the vault. The woman standing on the sidewalk now understood that power wasn't just about violence. It was about the truth you chose to record. "I won't be owned, Ji-hoon," I told him, mirroring his focus. "I'm not asking to own you," he replied. "I'm asking you to stand beside me." I looked toward the horizon, where the cranes of the redevelopment district were already moving again, resuming the work of reshaping the city. My mother's story had ended at the Wakekeep, but mine was just beginning. I turned and walked toward the car, no longer a victim of my heritage, but its master. I stepped into the shadow of the syndicate, not as a captive, but as an equal.